Hello, this is Dr. Jacqueline Rainosek with DTP Leadership Group, and this is Hot Topic, Bold Talk. When democracy is tested, Americans fight back. And I want you to know that this podcast is a reflection on citizenship, courage, and the Constitution. The measure of a democracy is not whether it is ever tested. Every democracy has been tested. The measure is whether ordinary citizens choose to become extraordinary when the test arrives. So, welcome. Welcome to podcast 182. I'm not going to begin with Donald Trump. I want to begin with America. Because America is the largest story. America is the inheritance. America is the responsibility of all of us, and America is a promise that each generation receives, tests, and repairs and passes forward. Democracy is not inherited, it is borrowed. Every generation receives it from those who came before. Every generation decides whether to strengthen it or weaken it. Every generation decides whether to protect it with courage or neglect it through silence. Every generation eventually faces a moment when history asks this question of all of us. What did you do when democracy was tested? My friends, I believe we're living in one of the most important moments. We are watching the Constitution, the courts, the Congress, the voting rights, the press, the free press, the rule of law is constantly being tested. We are watching a president who too often appears to place personal power above public service. We are watching efforts to challenge mail-in ballots, pressure institutions, reshape electoral maps, intimidate opponents, and treat the machinery of democracy as something to be bent toward one man's advantage. But this podcast is not only about what Donald Trump is doing, it is about what Americans are doing in response. The hopeful truth is this: citizens are showing up, judges are showing up, election workers are showing up, members of Congress are showing up, journalists are showing up, state leaders are showing up, advocacy organizations are showing up, and voters are showing up. And in a democracy, that is what matters. America has never depended on perfect leaders. If it had, we would not have lasted this long. America is dependent on you and me, the citizens, who understand that liberty requires responsibility. It depends on people being willing to say in their own time and their own way, this is not going to happen on my watch. Not on my watch will voting rights be quietly dismantled. Not on my watch will the Constitution become optional. Not on my watch will housing, health care, safety, and dignity be used as bargaining chips for political power. Not on my watch will fear replace citizenship. That is the spirit, I think, that we all need to have. One of the clearest examples of our current crisis involves something that should never have become a political hostage. Affordable housing. Across this country, millions of Americans are struggling to pay rent. Young families are delaying buying homes because the prices move beyond their reach. Senior citizens are wondering whether they can remain in the communities they've helped to build. Teachers, nurses, firefighters, police officers, veterans, and working families are asking whether the American dream still includes a stable home. Housing is not a policy. Housing is dignity. Housing is when a child knows where she or he will sleep tonight. Housing is a parent not choosing between rent and medicine. Housing is a veteran finding stability after being of service to our country. Housing is a young couple believing that their future can include a front door, a kitchen table, and a neighborhood where they belong. So when Congress manages to come together in rare bipartisan cooperation to help Americans with housing, that should be a moment of national relief. That's what the Congress did. It should remind us that even in a divided era, government can still function. Republicans and Democrats can compromise, and public service can still rise above party warfare. Well, when that kind of bipartisan progress is delayed or threatened because a president wants leverage for other political demands, Americans have the right to be outraged. I'm not merely disappointed, I'm outraged. Because ordinary people should not become pawns in one leader's struggle for power. Affordable housing should not be held hostage. The needs of families should not be pushed aside. Congress should not be punished for doing its job, and the suffering of Americans should never be treated as a bargaining chip to get something he wants. Be assured that is not leadership. Leadership means serving the people. Leadership means recognizing that government exists to solve problems, not manufacture crises. Leadership means caring about the family, wondering whether rent will rise again next month. Leadership means remembering that behind every policy debate are human beings trying to live with dignity. This is where the moral question begins. Does the government exist for the people, or do the people exist for the ambitions of those in power? The American answer has always been very clear. The government belongs to the people. The Constitution begins with we the people because power flows from citizens upward, not rulers downward. That is why attacks on voting rights are so dangerous. Voting is not simply one civic activity among many. Voting is the foundation of our self-government. It is the peaceful method by which citizens decide who exercises power in their name. When voting is weakened, democracy is weakened. When eligible voters are discouraged, confused, intimidated, or blocked, Americans become less American. That is why challenges to mail-in voting matters. Mail-in ballots are not abstractions. They are used by seniors, military families, disabled Americans, students, rural voters, working parents, and citizens who cannot easily stand in line for hours on election day. They are part of how millions of eligible Americans participate in our democracy. When a president attempts to reshape voting rules through executive orders, the question is not only whether one policy is wise or unwise, the deeper question is constitutional. Does one president have the power to override the electoral system that states and Congress are supposed to regulate? The question is now before the courts. And the fact that courts are allowing challenges to proceed should encourage all of us. It means the system is still working. It means judges are still asking whether a person has the right to take away the voting rights of citizens of the United States. This is how, by the courts doing something about this and refusing to have violence or intimidation decide what's going to happen with voting rights, that's when finally democracy breathes. It takes a breath through the courts, through the ballots, through public debate, through citizens refusing to surrender their rights. The rule of law is not a slogan, it is the spine of the republic. The rule of law means the president obeys the law. Congress obeys the law. Governors obey the law. Judges obey the law. Citizens obey the law. No one stands above it. Not the rich, not the famous, not the powerful, and not the president. That is what separates constitutional democracy from authoritarian government. In authoritarian government, law bends around the leader. In democracy, leaders must bend to the law. That is why I'm so appreciative of an article I read by Austin Weatherford. And he framed it in this way: the rule of Trump versus the rule of law. And it's a very important article. It captured the central choice before us. Will America remain a nation governed by our laws, institutions, and constitutional limits? Or will it drift toward a system where loyalty to one man becomes more important than loyalty to the Constitution? This is not a small distinction. It is everything, as far as I'm concerned. The founders wrote the Constitution because they did not trust unchecked power. They had already lived under a king. They understood that ambitious leaders always find reasons to demand more authority. They knew fear could be used to persuade citizens to surrender freedom. They knew charismatic figures could become dangerous when separated from accountability. And that's what's happened to him. So they need to have checks and balances. That's true for the Congress, the courts, the states, the press, and all of us. Every one of these institutions is now being tested. And every time one of them stands firm, democracy gains another breath. When a federal judge rejects overreach, democracy breathes. When courts examine subpoenas and executive actions, democracy breathes. When Congress votes to reclaim its constitutional role over war powers, democracy breathes. When journalists resist pressure and continue reporting, democracy breathes. When organizations like Public Citizen remind us by independent institutions and how they matter, democracy breathes. When the National Democratic Redistricting Committee fights against unfair maps, democracy breathes. When state leaders that live in Florida, like Nikki Fried, urge people not to give up, democracy breathes. When Maricopa County Democrats in Arizona and in local volunteers educate voters in the face of distrust and intimidation, then democracy breathes. When South Carolina refuses to automatically bend its maps to partisan pressure, democracy breathes. When citizens in Georgia fight for fair representation, democracy breathes. And when ordinary Americans decide that despair is not an option, democracy breathes. And that is a story that we must stand by and we must tell to others. Yes, Trump's testing our democracy. Yes, he's pushing every institution. Yes, he appears determined to consolidate power wherever he can. Yes, too many of his allies seem willing to excuse his behavior. They would condemn if he were any other president. But America is not powerless. We are not specters. We are citizens of the United States. The word citizen has become too small, in my estimation, in our modern day vocabulary. We need to treat citizenship as though it means possessing more than a passport or voting every few years. Citizenship is much larger than that. Citizenship, to me, is stewardship. It means paying attention. It means learning the facts. It means defending rights not only when they belong to us, but when they belong to people with whom we disagree. It means refusing to let political parties replace moral judgment. It means remembering that our neighbor is still our neighbor, even when we vote differently. That is not a weakness. That is democratic strength. America has always argued. We've argued about the Constitution itself. We've argued about slavery. We've argued about women's suffrage. We argue about labor or civil rights or war or taxation or health care or immigration and the meaning of equality. Disagreement is not an enemy to democracy. The enemy of democracy is the belief that only one side has the right to govern, only one leader has the right to rule, only one group has the right to vote, and only one version of the truth is allowed. That is when democracy begins to fail. We must not let that happen. Not on my watch. We need to say, not on your watch, and not on our watch. There's another institution we must defend, and that is the free press. Americans have every right to criticize news organizations. We should demand accuracy, fairness, courage, and accountability from journalists. Government pressure against media outlets is dangerous because citizens need independent sources of information. A free press is not perfect, but a controlled press is not free. When ABC urges viewers to push back against pressure from federal investigators, then we need to realize what is going on. The issue is much bigger. The issue is whether journalists can investigate the government without fear of political punishment. And the issue is whether citizens receive information from independent reporters or from leaders who only want praise and cannot tell the truth. Democracy requires truth, not perfect truth, not partisan truth, but a shared commitment to evidence, facts, transparency, and accountability. Without truth, citizens cannot govern themselves. Without truth, elections become emotional manipulation. Without truth, public debate collapses into tribal warfare. Without truth, power becomes easier to abuse. That is why attacks on journalism, voting, courts, and Congress belong to the same story. They are all attacks on accountability. A president who dislikes accountability will dislike judges. He's not going to like the Supreme Court. He's not going to like anyone that questions him. He's not going to like journalists or inspector generals or opposition parties or state officials and voters who say no. But see, democracy depends on us having the right to say no. No, we may not ignore the law. No, we may not be silent when the press is being pressured. No, we may not allow intimidation of voters. No, you may not use government power for personal revenge. No, you may not turn public service into personal rule. That is what constitutional democracy sounds like when it awakens. And America is waking up, and we need to be more awake than ever. Across this country, citizens are beginning to understand that democracy cannot be protected only in Washington. It must be protected in school board meetings or county election offices, state legislatures. It needs to be in every aspect that we can think of: courtrooms, newsrooms, churches, universities, union halls, neighborhood gatherings, churches, kitchen table conversations. Democracy lives close to home. Lives when a grandmother drives her neighbor to vote. It lives when a teacher explains the Bill of Rights. It lives when a young person registers for the first time. It lives when an election worker counts ballots carefully, even while being criticized. It lives when a judge reads the Constitution instead of reading the political mood. It lives when a veteran reminds us that the oath is to the Constitution, not to a person. And it lives when citizens refuse cynicism. Cynicism is one of the authoritarian's greatest allies. When people believe nothing matters, they stop participating. When they stop participating, power becomes easier to capture. When power becomes easier to capture, democratic institutions weaken. And when institutions weaken, then citizens become more cynical. That cycle must be broken. Hope is not naive. Hope is disciplined citizenship. Hope is what tells us to keep voting when maps are unfair. Hope is what tells us to keep organizing when powerful people mock us. Hope is what tells us to keep speaking when lies are louder. Hope is what tells us that democracy is difficult because it is worth having. The National Democratic Redistricting Committee understands that hope must be organized. Fair maps do not draw themselves. Fair elections do not protect themselves. Voting rights do not protect themselves. Citizens and organizations must do the hard, patient, often unglamorous work of protecting representation. Public citizen understands the institutions matter. The lesson of September 11th, which they just wrote on, reminds us that national security depends on competent professional systems, not on personality cults. A nation as powerful as the United States cannot afford to replace expertise with loyalty tests. And that's what's going on in the military and in the judicial system. Members of Congress who vote to limit unauthorized military escalation understand that war powers must remain constitutional. No president should be able to move the nation toward war without accountability. The lives of American service members are too precious. The Constitution is too clear. The Constitution makes it very clear the stakes are too high when we go to war. So it must be the consideration of the representatives of the people. State leaders resisting voter suppression understand that democracy is not simply about who wins. It is about whether the process remains fair enough that citizens trust the results. And ordinary Americans understand something even deeper. They understand that the country we live in is one right now that we cannot leave behind. We have to shape what is going on and not tolerate what is happening. Years from now, our grandchildren will not remember every headline that we've been angry about this week. They will not remember every executive order. They will not remember every television argument. They will remember what they inherit. The consequences of the choices we make will determine what they inherit. I want them to inherit the courts that were defended, not the courts that failed to defend. They need to inherit the voting rights we protect. I don't want to allow the erosion. They will inherit, hopefully, the truth we insist on rather than abandoning the truth. They will inherit the courage we show. We cannot choose to be silent. That is why this time in our lives truly matters. Again, I want to remind you, democracy is not inherited. It's not inherited. It is borrowed. And one day someone will want to ask what we did with what we had. I personally hope we can say we showed up. I hope we can say that when affordable housing was held hostage, we remembered the families who needed help. I hope we can say that when voting rights were threatened, we defended every eligible citizen's right to participate. And I hope we can say that when courts were pressured, we defended judicial independence. I hope we can say that when journalists were intimidated, we defended the free press. And I hope we can say that when Congress needed to reclaim its role, we demanded constitutional courage. I hope we can say that when Congress needed to reclaim its role, we demanded that it have that courage. I hope we can say that when democracy was tested, we did not collapse in despair. We became citizens, real citizens, awake citizens, responsible citizens. Citizens who understand that America is not saved by one election, by one court case, by one organization, or by one leader. America is saved again and again by people who decide that freedom is worth the work. So, my friends, patriotism is not pretending America has no problems. Patriotism is loving America enough to solve those problems. Patriotism is not blind loyalty to a president. It is faithful loyalty to the Constitution. Patriotism is not hatred of those who disagree with us. It is the discipline of defending a system where disagreement can exist without violence. That is America worth protecting. That is the America our ancestors struggled toward. That is the America our children deserves. So I'm asking you again, what kind of America do you want to leave behind? An America where one man's power matters more than millions of citizens? Or an America where the Constitution still stands above every president? An America where voting becomes harder and representation becomes distorted? Or an America where every eligible citizen has a voice? An America where truth is replaced by propaganda? Or an America where facts still matter? An America where fear governs? Or an America where citizens show up? I know which America I believe in. I believe in the America where judges say, not on my watch will this happen. Where voters say, not on my watch. When teachers say, not on my watch. Where journalists say, not on my watch. Where veterans say, not on my watch. Where young people cast their first ballots and say, not on my watch. Where grandparents who voted for 60 years say, not on my watch. Where ordinary citizens understand that extraordinary moments require extraordinary courage. Where ordinary citizens understand that extraordinary moments require extraordinary courage. America survived presidents. America has survived parties. America has survived war, depression, scandals, assassinations, terrorism, pandemics, and division. She has survived because enough Americans in each generation remembered that democracy was not theirs to keep forever. See, our democracy is borrowed. We don't have it forever. It is ours to protect for those who come after us. Now it is our turn. May history say that when democracy was tested, Americans remembered who they were. They defended the Constitution. They protected the vote. They respected the rule of law. They spoke truth. They showed courage. They disagreed without surrendering their humanity. They loved their country enough to keep improving it because democracy was never inherited. It was borrowed. And with humility and courage and determination, we pass it forward to a generation we may never meet, who may someday thank us for showing up. And thank you for listening. May God bless each of you. May God bless those who quietly serve this republic every day. And may God bless the United States of America.